All right, guys, here we go. Finishing up the notes for chapter 21. We're going to talk now about decibels. And this is where we get into the conversation about the VU meter. If you want to get a sense as to what various decibel levels represent in terms of what we hear in the everyday world, there's a short list in your textbook, and I would encourage you to check that out. One of the things that's a little bit confusing when we talk about decibels is that decibel is an actual measurement of sound, and that's what that list in the textbook represents. But we tend to use the same terminology when we're talking about levels of audio in the studio relative to what we're talking about with the ideal levels. And they don't necessarily match up apples to apples. What you need to understand is that when we talk about those things in the studio, what we're actually talking about is something called the standardized reference. This was arrived by producing a 1 kilohertz sine wave at 0.775 volts RMS, which then became the 0 dB VU reference on the old analog VU meters, VU standing for volume unit. So we use the dB terminology, the decibel terminology, but it's not quite exactly the same thing. So it's audio, folks. It's the industry. It's what we do. Basically, try to understand that in terms of whether you're talking about the real world experience or what we're talking about in the studio. So as far as what we're talking about in the studio, the 0 VU reference was the equivalent of a specific measurement in decibels, so 0 VU also became known as 0 dB. So that's how that came about. At some point, an analog signal hotter than 0 dB VU would begin to distort, usually at around plus 20. The difference between the optimal recording level and the point of distortion is known as headroom. So we're talking now about once we get into the overmodulation and what's more of a danger zone. Digital audio uses 0 dBFS as the ceiling. So there's a distinction here. There is what we talked about with 0 on the VU meter in the analog world, which is the ideal sound level, where in the digital world, 0 is the maximum that we can go without getting into distortion. Once you get above 0 in the digital world, you get into what's called clipping, where you start losing pieces of the audio or it just sounds way overmodulated. Everything below 0 being a negative number, and this is what we refer to as the full scale, again with 0 being the max. Now, this is a point where the author and I kind of part ways a little bit here. The textbook says that the optimum recording level is around minus 18 on your digital meter. Now, you want to be careful with that because even digital studios are going to be set up in certain ways where calibration issues come into play, and you really need to experiment and determine what the optimum recording level is. I am of that mindset that you want to get as close to 0 as you can without going over. You do have to be careful that in the digital world, you really can't go over 0 at all. Otherwise, you have that overmodulation, you have that clipping issue. I like to shoot for between minus 15 and minus 3. It gives the opportunity for you to have the fullness of your audio. It minimizes the interference of ambient room noise. It also minimizes any effect of electrical noise that may be going on. But it's really going to be dependent on your setup and on your situation. So really there's going to be some trial and error whenever you have a new setup to know where the optimum recording level is going to be. So keep that in mind. Now let's talk about noise. All electronic equipment has internal noise that is generated by the mere fact that electricity is running through it. Also, all acoustic environments have a base noise level, usually referred to as room tone. So you have two different sources of outside noise that could affect your recordings. That's the ambiance and the room noise, just kind of incidental noise that your microphone might pick up. And then there's electrical noise that can happen because, when we're recording, we're dealing with a lot of electronic equipment. And that is going to generate certain types of tones and buzzes and that sort of thing. Where really, if you have electrical noise as an issue, that's something where you're going to want to experiment and perhaps replace some chords, replace some configurations in your setup to reduce that noise to as minimal as possible, if not eliminate it completely. Room tone, though, is something that can be managed mostly by the way that you use your microphone and use your equipment to make sure that you are getting as crisp and clear and clean a sound in your recording as you possibly can, so that any room noise is going to be negligible in the final product. Normalization is a software process in which the computer scans the recording for the loudest spike and increases the volume of the recording equally so that the loudest audio spike is brought up to a predetermined maximum volume. So if you do a recording and the loudest part of your audio registers at -15, if you normalize that audio, it's going to increase everything in your sound file 15 decibels so that your peak is now at 0. Now, here's the danger. When you normalize your recording, you are also proportionately increasing all of that room noise along with any electronic noise that you have. So it is going to take all of it and amplify it. And that is why you'll hear lots of noise or hiss in normalized recordings that start at too low of a recording level. The best way to combat that is to watch your meter readings and get that volume as loud as you can without going over so that you don't have to normalize your audio. Normalization should be seen as a last resort, not as something that you do on an every recording basis. The difference between the loudness of your voice and any noise is called the signal-to-noise ratio. The greater the signal-to-noise ratio, the quieter the recording, and that's what we're shooting for. Recording levels that are too high are commonly referred to as clipping. If you record too hot, in other words, if you're consistently going over 0, you will actually be losing data. Don't go over. Stay in that sweet spot, -15 to -3. The best way to determine your optimal recording levels will be to experiment with your equipment and software. Again, it's a trial and error sort of process. Now, let's talk about your recording software. You can run the gamut from not paying anything for your audio software to paying thousands of dollars for the latest and greatest with all the different toys. Pro Tools is the industry standard, especially in the music recording industry. It is a rather complex piece of software. It has a really stringent learning curve. I've tried using Pro Tools a few times, and I really have to stop and think about what I'm doing when I'm using that software. Now, of course, there's things in the middle. Lots of radio broadcast studios are using Adobe Audition, which is why that's what we teach at CCCC. so that when you're using software and you're learning how to edit on that software, you're using the stuff that the vast majority of radio studios are using. Now, a lot of radio studios are also using Audacity. It's a free open source piece of software. It is considered by many to be among the best open source audio recording softwares available. It is free software. It is a free download for Windows, Mac, and Linux. And it does have some pretty powerful tools. The ways that you use the software is not quite as intuitive as something like an Adobe Audition and other types of commercially available software, but it does have it's a pretty effective thing once you learn how to use it. And the website to download it is available there in your notes. Also, if you go back to last semester's class, I do give a quick little primer on how to do simple recording and editing using Audacity if you look up the video Doing Labs at Home. Now, the project itself. An audio project is simply a computer file that contains references to a variety of other files and components, which, when combined, result in a complete finished recording. You can think of an audio project almost like a shelf of books. So if you've got a shelf in your bookshelf in your room or in your library, in your house, you have all the books for your broadcasting courses, for example. So you may go into that folder and see all of your broadcasting courses on that one particular shelf, just like you would see all of your broadcasting files in your broadcasting folder on your computer. And then you can even break it down into different sections. So you have your speech books, you have your radio books, you have your TV books, and you can do the same thing there. And each individual book would be the equivalent to a project. You can kind of think of it that way. An audio mix is the production process where all of the tracks within a project are balanced to result in the desired sound. So when you open up an audio project and you see each track, each with its own audio element, we do what we call in Audition a mix down. That it takes all of those tracks and then the software will process that and put all the appropriate edits in all the right places and mix all of those different separate pieces of audio into one waveform. And then once that mix is set, the project is rendered to create the output file. In Audacity, we call it exporting to a particular MP3 or WAV or whatever we're saving it as. In Audition, we call it saving to WAV or MP3 or whatever. Basic editing. Editing, the process of repairing or reassembling the sequence of the recorded sounds. Now, a common mistake in editing is to overlook the timing or phrasing between words and sentences. If the edit is too tight or too loose, the phrasing will sound wrong. It's very easy to forget about the fact that in speech we have a normal cadence to the way that we talk. We expect our breaks in between thoughts to be a certain length, in between certain sentences to be a certain length. And if we're not careful to be conscious of that when we're editing, we could wind up with a finished product that does not sound natural. And it's going to ruin the entire scope of the recording because people will hear it and basically react thinking we sound weird. So you want to be very conscious of that when you're doing editing. Now, adjusting the timing for an edit might result in a gap of digital silence at the end point. Digital silence is a complete absence of sound and will usually be heard as a drop or a cutoff of the audio, which can be perceived as a mistake. So this is where that room noise and electrical noise all comes into play, because there's always going to be a little bit of that in every recording. And you can hear the distinction between if we have that room noise in the background and then if we have nothing at all. So we want to avoid people basically hearing and realizing that there's nothing there, because again, it'll sound weird, it'll sound unnatural. So to solve this problem, if you record a few seconds of room tone, the natural sound of your recording environment, basically have your mic open, record for a few seconds, and keep that and use that to insert into places where you want to have a pause. And it's going to benefit your recording in the end. Now, to avoid clicks or audible edits, the waveform should retain its natural flow as it crosses the centered line. If you take a look in your textbook at figure 21.5, it shows you a visual representation of what we're talking about. Basically, as much as is possible, whenever you're doing an edit, you want to edit from wherever the waveform crosses the center line, because otherwise, if you're not starting from that 0 point, ending at that 0 point with your full complete edit, you do have the risk of creating an audible edit in the form of a little click or a tap or something like that that comes out as a result of creating the edit. We want to avoid that as much as we possibly can. Signal processing. That's defined as any electronic process that affects the recorded audio signal. Things like normalization, equalization, compression, noise reduction, all of these different things. That is all under the umbrella of signal processing. The three most common types of audio processing that are misunderstood or misused. First, compression. Compression is a process that balances out the peaks in your recording, the smoothing out of the overall recording levels between low volume and louder sections. In Adobe Audition, we call this the hard limit. In Audacity, it is called the limiter. So what it'll do is it will create this normalization of audio to a certain point where you can tell the audio to increase by a certain volume level. But if it reaches a certain plateau, that kind of creates a ceiling of how loud the audio will go. So it will create a more uniform audio level, which can be good or bad. It is something you want to be very careful of using, because if you're not getting the full breadth of volume that a voice actor is using when they're supposed to be loud as opposed to being soft, it can create an unnatural sound in the recording. Equalization, or EQ, is a process that can compensate for problems at specific frequencies. It's similar to the bass and treble tone controls on some audio equipment. It's controlling the punchiness or the intensity of your highs and your mids and your lows. And it's something that you want to be very careful in using, because you still want to create an overall natural sound for your voice. And again, in most cases where you are creating audio that's going to be sent to an engineer, I wouldn't use equalization at all. I would leave that up to the engineer. The times that you would use equalization is if you do need to have a certain tweak to the low range of the sound or the high range of a sound or something like that, but I would use that very sparingly. Thirdly, normalization. That's the process of proportionately increasing the overall loudness of the entire recording to a preset maximum level as determined by the loudest spike in the audio. And again, keep in mind, when you use normalization, it increases everything in your audio, not just your voice. It's also going to increase the level of the room noise that is heard and the electrical noise that is heard. Most producers will prefer a completely unprocessed voice track at proper levels. This allows them to make audio processing adjustments at their end during post-production. So when you apply audio processing to your recording, you are making a subjective judgment about what you think your recording should sound like. This may or may not be what the producer is looking for. So again, unless you're the one that is producing the final product, you don't want to use these different tools. Record your natural voice. Record what you naturally produce and leave the tweaking to the editor. Because your job is to deliver the highest quality, clean voiceover recording that you can deliver, not to demonstrate your subjective opinions through audio processing. It's not your job. Do your job. That's it. Now, rendering. Rendering is the process of compiling all of the component parts of a project into a final delivery format. In most cases, that's going to be either WAV or MP3. The WAV and AIFF native audio formats do create very large files because they're uncompressed. There is the highest quality of the audio that we can possibly get in the digital world. And they are extremely large files. So they're good files to have for editing and for production and for keeping raw files, but they're not very practical for delivering files by email. Many times, if you have a longer audio file, you're not going to be able to send that WAV file through email because email just can't handle that large of a file. Most of today's auditions and paid products will be rendered to a compressed MP3 file at 128 kilobits per second at 44.1 kilohertz. When you save in the MP3 format, it saves at about 1/10 of the size of the original native format file. And because it's a quality enough recording, it is what tends to be the preferred choice of most people to receive a final product in. For paid projects, though, you should always ask your client how they would like you to render your files for delivery. So all of the things that we've talked about are suggestions and what tends to be the standard. But the customer is always right. The client is always right. You give them what they want. In delivering rendered files, it's always a good idea, again, to ask your client how they would like the files to be delivered. Not just what format, but what method they would like to have the file sent to them. Regardless of the delivery method used, make sure that you follow your client's file naming protocol to the letter. If they want you to name it a certain way, you name it that certain way. Talent agents have a reputation for not accepting misnamed audition files. Another reason for this is because, especially in the radio world, there are certain automation structures that take place where files may get automatically downloaded based on the name of the file. So on the producer side, they may have a computer system that is looking for a specific string of characters in the file name. So you need to conform to that naming protocol in order for them to actually recognize and receive the file. But whether they have that or not, if you're told to name your file in a certain way and send it in a certain way, you do it exactly the way that they told you to. And with that, we're going to finish up chapter 21. So you know what to do at this point. Get those notes and study questions finished up and turned in. And make sure you're available for class to talk about the chapter. Bring in your insights and your questions, topics for discussion. Complete the survey. That helps us to be able to have a good discussion. It lets me know what you're thinking and what perhaps needs a little more explanation. And of course, make sure you're continuing to monitor Cougar Mail and Blackboard for any updates and changes in the class.